So would you like to tell us about a study that you have used recently that used this method?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, we pre-record all of our videos. So in the particular study that I use this method with, we were interested in how children use social categories to make predictions about others. So in some of my prior work, we have found that young infants use social group membership to make predictions about, or they expect that members of the same social group will prefer the same foods. So if
Oh,
individuals are dressed similarly and they're labeled similarly, they will expect that they will choose the same foods to eat. So this is present really early in life, but we also know that this has to be somewhat learned. The particular beliefs that people form about social groups, they vary across ages, they vary across cultures, different places in the world, they form different stereotypes about different groups of people. So we know that although the tendency to maybe group people or use a heuristic to sort of make predictions about people, maybe some parts of that are built in, but the particular beliefs and inferences that we're making, that has to be learned. So this study was sort of trying to get at that. How are children learning these things? And it has to be somewhat learned from the environment.
okay.
So we wanted to investigate how parents and language sort of played a role in this learning. So what we did was we had a picture book that described a made-up social group called Zarpies. And the reason that we used a made-up social group is because we didn't want to, one, teach children anything about a real social group, and two, to make sure that children didn't have any prior beliefs or expectations. So this is a completely made-up social group, and parents first went through just a paragraph that sort of described this social group. So it told them that Zarpies were from this particular place in the world. They were all very similar to one another, had similar DNA and biology, because it's a made-up social group. So we sort of had to give parents some background about what Zarpies were. And after reading that paragraph, they then went and read a picture book with their child. So the parent and the child were the only ones in the room. And we gave them a picture book. On each page of the book, there was a picture of a Zarpie displaying a certain behavior or characteristic. And accompanying that picture was a sentence that described what was going on. And what we did was we manipulated the language that was in the book. So some sentences were generic sentences. So these generic sentences are sentences that describe groups as a whole. So it might say, look at this Zarpie. Zarpies like to bounce a ball on their head. So some parents received those sentences, whereas other parents received sentences that didn't include a social group label at all. So instead, the sentence might say, look at this one. This one likes to bounce a ball on their head. So we manipulated the language in the book because previous work has found that generic statements do have influences on children's expectations. So we wanted to see if, based on this really brief interaction, if children could learn about a social group and then form some beliefs about how they should behave. So we had parents read through the book. We told them to read the sentences out loud to their child and to then just describe the book and how they typically would read a story to their child. On
How
average, I
long
would
was the book?
say
Was it just
it was 13 different characteristics. So, but on
okay?
average, the book sessions probably lasted about 15 minutes, so they weren't very
Okay.
long.
Okay.
But yeah, they could go as long as they wanted. If they wanted to talk about it for an hour, they could, but that was
I
not
see.
typical.
Okay.
And after reading through the book, then they went to do a violation of expectation task, where we showed them recorded videos of a person dressed as a Zarpie displaying behaviors that were either consistent with the behaviors that they learned about in the book or inconsistent with the behaviors that they learned about in the book. So for instance, in the book, children learn about, in the generic condition, they learn about Zarpies hating ice cream. So Zarpies hate ice cream. And so in the video event, they would be shown, yeah. In the video event, they would see a Zarpie hating ice cream, which is consistent with what they learned about in the book. And then they would also see a video of a Zarpie liking ice cream. which is
Okay.
inconsistent with that in the book. So we show them these different video events and we record their looking time to each of those events. So if children learned about Zarpies and they expect Zarpies to be similar and to have all these similar characteristics, then they should expect the Zarpies in the video tasks to behave in a Zarpie consistent manner, and they should look longer when the Zarpie displays an inconsistent behavior than what they learned about in the book. So they should look longer at Zarpies liking ice cream. So if they aren't learning anything about Zarpies, then all of these events should seem equally plausible. So they should look equally to the Zarpie inconsistent and consistent. So essentially what we found was that only the children that received the generic statements in the book learned about Zarpies. The children that didn't receive the generic statements did not learn about Zarpies. So we found that interesting that even after this really brief parental session of them reading some sentences about Zarpies, that they expected that new Zarpies would also behave in a similar manner. So that was pretty striking.
Was the violation of expectations, was it right after the book? So there wasn't much of a delay. It was just immediately after.
There was not much of a delay. So that would be an interesting follow-up potentially of seeing how long these beliefs sort of stay ingrained in their mind if there was a delay. But yes, it was right after. But they are young, so memory is sort of...
Wait, how old did you say?
These are 36-month-old children. They're not really children.
Got it. So only if the parent used the word Zarpie in the reading of the book. But if the book itself just said, look at this one does this and that and the other, then they did not generalize it to Zarpies. Is that right? Wow.
Correct. And it's when they talked about the Zarpie group as a whole. So not necessarily like the generic statement was, look at this Zarpie, Zarpies love. So it's slightly different than look at this Zarpie loves. So we didn't make that distinction. It was either Zarpies as a whole or a specific person. Does that make sense? And we also found that because we also, in the book session, we transcribe everything that the parent says. So we have transcribers go through and just type out word for word what the parents say. And then we went back and looked at some different statements, different types of statements that parents made. And what we found was that in the generic conditions specifically, so when parents received those generic sentences, they were more likely to make these statements that compared and contrasted their child to the Zarpie. So for instance, they might say, oh, Zarpies hate ice cream. And they'd be like, but you don't hate ice cream, you love ice cream. So they started making these more comparative and contrastive statements, comparing the child to the Zarpies. And they also made more generic statements spontaneously. So after reading the generic statement in the book, they then went on to make more generic statements about the Zarpie behaviors. So sort of getting at the type of language that we use sort of primes us to think about social groups in this very broad sense and to make these really broad generalizations about them, even generalizations that weren't necessarily said. So we're sort of piggybacking off of that.
That kind of thinking just leads to more of that kind of thinking. You can sort of see how stereotypes could pretty easily develop if people are thinking about social groups that way.
Exactly, because generalizations are things that it's normal to make a generalization. It's a heuristic, it's a shortcut that we use, but it becomes sort of pernicious and negative when we start to make these generalizations about real social categories.
Your work and this study in particular seem like they could be related to the use of ethnic and gender stereotypes and racial stereotypes and that sort of thing. Do you see that there's a connection there? Are there lessons we might learn about the way racial stereotypes work based on your research?
Right. I think the main takeaway is that the way that we talk about people and about social groups has very profound implications, even with really young infants or young children. So already here at 36 months, we see after 15 minutes, they're already learning and making these wide sweeping generalizations about a made up social category. So imagine being in the real world where they're being exposed to actual social categories all the time. And a lot of times we're not really thinking about how we're talking about social groups. We might say these things offhand, but really these generic statements where we're making sweeping generalizations. So stereotypes like girls are bad at math. That's like a stereotype that some people have in their minds. And a lot of times even teachers don't realize that they're sort of enforcing this stereotype by themselves saying like, I'm not good at math, things like that. That can have this pernicious influence that then makes children sort of highlight these different social categories and make these. So yeah, I think main takeaway is like, wow, the way that we talk about social groups is really influential.
It really matters.